Thank you all for coming. So today we're super excited to bring you Will Potter. Will Potter is an award-winning author. He's a TED Senior Fellow, and he's an internationally recognized civil liberties advocate. His work challenging government repression and the labeling of protests as terrorism has appeared in top media outlets, and that includes the Washington Post, National Geographic, and Rolling Stone. Will has been awarded the prestigious Knight Wallace Fellowship, and he is now the Marsh Professor of Journalism at University of Michigan, where he teaches courses on investigative journalism, social movements, and whistleblowing. SALDIF, the Animal Law and Policy Program, the Food Law Society, and HLS's ACLU are thrilled that Will is able to join us today. So I want you all to join me in thanking Will for coming, and there will be some time at the end of his talk for Q&A. So thank you again for joining us.
Pleasure. I think I turned this on. Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you all for coming out during a lunchtime event. I know your schedules are swamped and there's a lot of stuff going on right now. And special thanks to Chris and Melissa and everybody at SALDIF for bringing me out. It's nice to see some friendly faces I haven't seen in a bit, and also to be back on campus. I think the last time I spoke here, this building wasn't around, and it's much nicer than the previous building we were in. And I got a falafel to go as well. I'll just put that in here. So I know we don't have a ton of time right now, so I'm going to kind of rock and roll through a lot of material pretty quickly with the hopes of having the potential to have some Q&A afterwards. But to get started, I wanted to say just a little bit of why I'm focusing on these issues in particular. My background's in investigative journalism. As we were talking over coffee earlier, I was on a very traditional career path for a long time. I was working at newspapers and magazines. I was at the Chicago Tribune reporting on shooting and murder and blood and guts and bodies found in storage lockers and all of the types of stories I never wanted to do for the rest of my life as a journalist. And it was leaving me feeling pretty dark and depressed. I mean, I went into journalism wanting to make some kind of positive difference in the world with my work, and that was not doing it. I also had a background in social justice organizing. I got involved in animal advocacy when I was in college, also protesting the economic sanctions on Iraq, things like that. And so when I was at the Tribune, we decided to go out hanging leaflets against animal testing. I thought it would be the absolute most I could do as a working journalist. It would be a safe way of doing something positive. And of course, I have the absolute worst luck ever, and we were all arrested. This is my arrest photo sitting on the ground surrounded by leaflets. Now, this was only a few months after September 11th. And shortly after, I was visited by two FBI agents who told me that unless I helped them by spying on protest groups, I would be put on a domestic terrorist list. And that experience, and the reason I wanted to bring that up, especially in this lecture, was really a turning point for me in my life, in my career, and how I'm thinking about these issues. I really became obsessed with trying to understand how people who are just distributing information could be labeled and threatened with a domestic terrorist list. And over the years after that, I was seeing some people I knew from activism going to prison as terrorists, seeing this expansion of the war on terrorism targeting animal rights and environmental activists. But really at the root of it, the start of all this for me was a battle over information. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you all about today, how that struggle for information is being played out in real life. But to understand how we're getting to this point, we need to go backwards a little bit to the early 1980s. The animal rights and environmental movements at that time, everybody see this okay with the lighting? The movements at that time were growing very quickly and very boldly. You had national above-ground animal protection groups, much like you have today, like the Humane Society and PETA, Sierra Club, Greenpeace. And then you also had people that were using underground illegal actions, like stealing this primate britches from site deprivation experiments and maternal deprivation experiments, taking photographs and video and releasing that information to the public. Now, clearly illegal, but also nonviolent and focused on raising public awareness that shut down these experiments. You also had groups like the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society that were coming up. They now have their, I don't know if they still have their show on Animal Planet, but they did for a while, steering small inflatable boats between the whalers' harpoons and the whales. And then you had a rise of nonviolent civil disobedience, groups like Earth First, blockading roads and locking themselves to logging equipment to stop the destruction of the natural world. Now, all of this was regarded favorably in the press. Every time you had those, even the most militant tactics, they were reported on and described as environmental warriors, environmental heroes. Even the more radical tactics were widely accepted, both within the movement and by the general public. And so the industry had a really big problem on its hands. You know, if you have organizations like PETA, who are lawful in their organizing, but also publicly supporting more militant tactics, and the public supports them as well, corporations had to find a way to knock these activists off of that moral high ground. And what they did was quite brilliant. In about 1985, they just made up a new word called eco-terrorist. They just developed it out of thin air, out of the industries themselves. And over the next 20 years, they used that language relentlessly to reframe the debate of how we think about animal protection and environmental issues. They took out ads in the New York Times and Washington Post. This one's from about 1986, created by the Fur Commission. It says, "Meet the world's newest terrorist. Don't tolerate terrorism in America. Fur is for life." And you kind of have this Steve Urkel / Williamsburg hipster kind of character, right? With an axe. There'd never been an attack by animal rights activists ever with an axe. But it started bubbling up. Those ad campaigns started merging into congressional hearings where those same industries were using the same rhetoric, the same billboards, the same advertising, the same aesthetic to push for new legislation labeling animal rights and environmental activism as terrorism. Over time, to make quite a long story very, very short, this worked. As a result, these animal rights and environmental activists, who in their entire history have never harmed a single human being in the United States, became labeled by the FBI as the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Not number 2 or number 27, but #1. It sent a very clear message to the public when you have people like an alleged fugitive animal rights activist listed on the FBI's website alongside Osama bin Laden. Now, throughout all of this, the FBI and federal agencies have been very intentional about who is and is not labeled as a terrorist. We're seeing this played out in really stark ways right now as well, right? It seems like every day there's another news story about people toppling tombstones in Jewish cemeteries or setting a mosque on fire, hate crimes rising across the country. When it comes to anti-abortion extremists, militia groups, white supremacists, groups who have sent anthrax through the mail, attacked judges, people like Dylan Roof who have committed murder, they're consistently omitted from FBI and law enforcement reports about domestic terrorism, while at the same time, nonviolent animal rights and environmental activists are listed as the #1 threat. So to put this another way, I started looking at the reports from those radical leftist animal rights anarchist institutions known as West Point, the military academy. And they were documenting a 300% increase in violence by right-wing groups over this period from early 1990s to early 2000s. In that time, right-wing groups had been responsible for 283 injuries and 71 deaths. In this same time period, this is the 3 years after September 11th, right? Just in those 3 years. In those same 3 years, the FBI, in its terrorism reports, said that every single act of domestic terrorism, except for one, was the work of animal rights and environmental activists. So you have quite a disconnect here, right? And there are two ways of looking at this. Either the FBI has absolutely no idea that in that period, there were 283 injuries and 71 deaths by these right-wing groups and militias. Or they do know this is happening, and they're choosing to intentionally downplay that violence while exaggerating the crimes committed by animal rights activists. And that kind of brings us very quickly up to a key piece of legislation I wanted to flag for you all that's really critical to understanding these issues right now. It's the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, a law that was previously called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. Now, I was invited to testify before Congress about my reporting before a hearing on the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. And of course, I initially, despite all my years living in DC and being so jaded about DC politics, I wanted to view it as an honor, right? It's an opportunity to actually influence the public discussion about these issues. And I quickly realized that was not at all the intention of this hearing. This is all public spectacle. It's theater. So you had me next to the FBI, Department of Justice, GlaxoSmithKline, an animal experimenter, and they were all, detailing the radical threats posed by animal rights activists, such as their attempts to create a museum honoring the animals that have been killed in animal experimentation. Or the vivisector who testified, she wasn't talking about criminal activity or violence. She was talking about people subscribed her to magazines without her consent. So she started getting all these magazine subscriptions. A lot of stuff that would be, I don't know, in a different context, probably a prank, or at worst, a low-level criminal activity. But at the same time all this was happening, as this radical new terrorism law was being introduced, the previous version of the law, that Animal Enterprise Protection Act, was being used in a really bold and ambitious way to prosecute a group of animal rights activists for running a controversial website. This group was called Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty. And the best way to understand Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, or SHAC, is I always think of Nelson from The Simpsons, if you guys have watched The Simpsons. He's always pointing and laughing whenever something bad happens to somebody else. And that was kind of the vibe of the SHAC website. Like, they posted news of both legal and illegal actions, everything from protests at an executive's home to news about broken windows at a Bank of America office, and anything related to this campaign to shut down a notorious animal testing lab called Huntington Life Sciences went up on the website. And with every single bit of news and information, they supported it and endorsed it and kind of had that Nelson tone, poking fun at their opponents. And the government argued in this case that speech, combined with other speech that this group was engaged in, which was publicly supporting, in theory and in their words, those more radical tactics, amounted to a criminal conspiracy. And so as a result of that, 6 individuals were sentenced as terrorists for conspiracy to violate the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. Now, I'm sure some of you have come across this already in your courses here at HLS, but conspiracy charges have been used historically by the government against social movements in particular when nothing else will stick. I mean, even going back to the anti-war movement and Dr. Spock, the baby doctor, he faced conspiracy charges for encouraging people to resist the draft. This is kind of a catch-all nebulous term that's used when nothing else is working to go after these movements. The charges levied against them, though, had some serious consequences. I mean, they faced between 1 and 6 years in prison. They were also charged under the Telecommunications Act for using this website to communicate, and also for encouraging things like black faxes. This is sending a fax machine, or a fax to the company they were protesting that's completely black except a little bit of white text. And they taped the ends together so that it would just run over and over to drain out their toner. And that was listed in court as an example of this kind of toner terrorism, I guess. But it seems silly in hindsight, but that was the nexus that the government was arguing. This overlap between legal speech, running a website that posting news of both legal and illegal actions, and this covert pranks / sabotage / theft of animals from laboratories. Now, when I was testifying, the FBI and Homeland Security and the industries that were supporting this law were saying 2 competing things simultaneously. On the one hand, they were saying, well, all of our efforts to target these radical animal rights extremists have been incredibly successful, and we need to build on this momentum by passing this new legislation. On the other hand, they were arguing, well, this has all been horribly ineffective, and we're not able to make any victories, so we need new legislation. So in other words, as these shack activists were being sentenced to prison as terrorists under the previous version of the law, they were saying new legislation was needed to go even further. They're taking out ads in Roll Call in the Hill warning of threats of animal rights activists. Now, the important changes that were made to this legislation weren't just in the title. You know, that shift to the language of terrorism was really important, of course. But even more important was taking a law that was already vague, already overbroad, already used to criminalize speech in this Stop Hunting and Animal Cruelty case, and tweaking it so that the law previously was focused on physical disruption to the operation of an animal enterprise, shifted to become anyone who damages or interferes with the operations of an animal enterprise. What that means is, originally that law was passed to target people who were doing stuff like that, the black mask with the primate. That was the focus. People who were actually breaking the law, going into laboratories, stealing animals, releasing animals from fur farms, clearly illegal activity that they were trying to get elevated sentences for. Now with this new law, they were pushing that aside. They're just trying to expand the net and wrap up more and more individuals as terrorists by doing things like interference with animal enterprises. That interference means anyone who intentionally damages or causes the loss of any real or personal property, which is later defined in the legislation as including the loss of profits. Or secondly, anyone who intentionally places a person in reasonable fear. Or third, the third way of get wrapped up under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is that conspiracy charge. Now remember though, how do you talk about, where'd it go? How do you talk about reasonable fear when for 20 years corporations have engaged in a campaign to make the unreasonable appear reasonable, even leading up to the passage of that legislation? Still trying to make the unreasonable appear reasonable. So that's one huge problem with the legislation that I testified about. Another is that it's so vague and so broad that anything is wrapped up as an animal enterprise. So if an industry, whether it be the circus or puppy mills or people who are just selling animal products, a McDonald's cafeteria here at Harvard Law, all of those can be construed as animal enterprises under the law. It also includes anyone who does business with any of those entities. So under, you remember that shack campaign that I mentioned, a key part of their efforts was analogous to the anti-apartheid movement. So they didn't just protest the laboratory itself, they were protesting anyone who did business with the laboratory. So UPS, FedEx, insurance providers. This law is specifically targeting that type of activity. And finally, which I take as a bit of a source of pride, in response to my testimony, they included an exemption at the end that said nothing in this law shall be construed to violate any prohibition, any clause of the First Amendment. If there's one thing to leave you all with today as future lawyers and probably lobbyists and policymakers, when members of Congress include language that say, trust us, this is constitutional, we promise, it's probably a good indication that you need to take a very close look at what they're actually trying to do. All of this was being lobbied for secretly, though. The only way I found out about the long list of corporations who were lobbying for this law is someone anonymously sent me a link to the website that they were using secretly. And being the good investigative journalist I am, I entered the username of test and the password of password. That's a good runner-up. It was test. Password was my first choice. And it opened wide up. And it had this entire list. This is just a sampling of some of the industries that were involved. All the nicest people, the chicken council, the pork industry, Pfizer, Wyeth, GlaxoSmithKline, the circus industry, the pet industry. Like I was saying, anyone who has any connection to animals whatsoever, they were all pushing this behind the scenes. Now, also on this website, you can see me listed here, Will Potter's blog. I was listed as an animal rights opposition, but they also had talking points and sample press releases, things that you should say to your members of Congress, everything you need to terrorize and criminalize a social movement. What was fascinating, though, of going through these pages is that I quickly learned these industries knew they did not have the votes necessary to make this law. They knew it. In their scorecards, in their documents, how they were talking to each other, not publicly, but to each other, they knew they did not have any of the votes that they needed. So what they did was pretty brilliant. When most members of Congress were on the National Mall breaking ground for a new memorial honoring Dr. King in Washington, D.C., there were a handful of members of the House that were gathered and actually moving forward with business. And they were using a procedure called suspension of the rules. Now, if you guys have interned or worked in D.C., you know that there's a lot of bills coming down the pipe constantly. And so Congress tries to expeditiously deal with as many of them as possible. So things that are deemed non-controversial can just be ushered through in this like conveyor belt fashion. So suspension of the rules can be used in this same week to honor a baseball team for winning the World Series, to rename a bridge in Delaware after the guy who created the Roth IRA. I mean, this is the caliber of stuff, right? And then it was also used to pass a new terrorism law that's so broad it labels what Dr. King did, nonviolent civil disobedience, as terrorism, but only if done in the name of animal rights. Does that make sense? So, in other words, this profound disconnect between how social movements are regarded by politicians, to be on one hand praising Dr. King and his outright law breaking, while at the same time passing a new law labeling that same activity by animal rights activists as terrorists. Now, when I testified, the members of the committee, I mean, it was kind of heated, as you would expect. I think it's the last time I'll ever be invited to testify before a House Intelligence Committee. Because the members of the committee all said, "Oh, Mr. Potter, you have no idea what you're talking about. These laws are never going to be used to go after First Amendment activity. Didn't you see that exemption we included at the bottom? And by the way, are you defending underground activists like the Animal Liberation Front? Because that's all this legislation is going to be targeting." Funny thing that the very first use of the law was not against arson. It was not against theft or burglary or broken windows or anything like that. It was targeting a group of activists in California who, in their course of conduct, according to the FBI, did things like create leaflets, ran a website, and chalked on the sidewalk using children's sidewalk chalk. That was the indictment against them, to bring Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act charges. Fortunately, the judge in that case agreed with the defense that this was frivolous and overreaching and dismissed it. But the message was very clear, right? The first shot across the bow after this new terrorism law was passed went against First Amendment activity. It was a clear indication of what these industries were trying to do. Another point I raised during my testimony was that this legislation is crafted so broad that it could be used against nonviolent undercover investigators, people who are documenting animal cruelty on factory farms, slaughterhouses. And again, the members of the committee said, "Oh no, this would never happen. This would never be used that way." Well, we got some documents from the FBI that showed, in fact, the FBI was considering terrorism prosecutions against nonviolent undercover investigators using the previous version of the law. This was dated in 2003. This expansion of how this language and how this criminalization of dissent is now targeting people who non-violently document animal cruelty. That's something that I never expected when I first started writing and reporting about these issues in 2000, 2001. These undercover investigations, though, have made such a profound change in how we as a culture are talking about food, the environment, and animal welfare, more importantly. I would argue the only way we've begun to see inside of these facilities, which raise and kill between 9 and 10 billion animals every single year in the United States alone for food, is through the work of undercover investigators. But when these investigations have come out, the response by the industry and the response by the politicians who are allied with them has not been to eliminate those most egregious practices, even when they are clearly violating the minimal animal welfare standards that exist for farm animals. It's been to label them economic terrorism. In this case, the Humane Society did an investigation in California that was so powerful and revealed cruelty so shocking that the slaughterhouse was actually shut down. That never happens, as people in the SALDIF group here can tell you about all the grisly details of why, but that type of direct, heavy-handed response to an animal cruelty charge just never happens when it comes to slaughterhouses and factory farms. But members of Congress, including Devin Nunes, responded by sending a letter to the USDA and saying, you have to open this place up right away. You can't close down a slaughterhouse for this. And he called it economic terrorism. Nunes is now the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. Much like the AETA, the first uses of these new ag-gag laws, these are state laws that specifically criminalize photography and video of animal cruelty on factory farms and slaughterhouses. The first prosecution under those laws was not about an undercover investigation even. It was a young woman named Amy Meyer who was filming animal cruelty from the public street in this grainy footage shot at a distance. You can see a cow being moved by a bulldozer, a cow too sick to even walk. I found out about her case and wrote about it, and the exposure of that use of the law led to such a backlash that the charges were actually dismissed in 24 hours, which is a rare victory in these cases. But again, that message was sent. The impact in the intention of this legislation to go after a wide range of lawful activity. Now, the theme that, as you can garner from this lecture so far, is that the industry is doing its best to keep consumers in the dark about what's actually happening behind closed doors on factory farms and slaughterhouses, while at the same time, they are operating secretly, both in those internal websites that I showed and through groups like ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council. Have you guys talked about ALEC at all in any of your classes? No? So ALEC is a secretive front group for corporations. Corporations pay tens of thousands of dollars to have membership to ALEC, which then hosts these gatherings of state lawmakers who are flown in from all over the country. And when you go to one of these ALEC conferences, the state lawmakers who attend and who have scholarships to attend then go off to New York and they see Broadway shows and they go skeet shooting and they go to amusement parks and have fancy dinners. And meanwhile, the corporate representatives, part of this coalition, stay behind in rooms like this one, and they literally are drafting legislation that then is taken by ALEC members and reintroduced across the country. So I'll use my falafel as my prop here. You know, when you stand up in before the State Hall and you're introducing this piece of new legislation that is documenting the dangers of animal rights extremism and this dangerous trend across the country, people have no idea that this was actually written by corporations. There are no fingerprints on it whatsoever. I should also point out, some of that model legislation that was created by ALEC specifically mentions anyone who takes pictures of an agriculture facility. It proposes the creation of a terrorist registry for people who are arrested for filming and things like that. And it also attempts to criminalize material and financial support, anyone who runs a website or a nonprofit or shares the video on YouTube. Now, if there's one thing I've seen over and over and over again doing this work, is that we're in an era where there's two messages being sent about information right now. One is that when it comes to the government, whether it's the NSA or FBI, they have an unobstructed right to access all information about us, you know, through PRISM, through social media, through surveillance of journalists, phone calls, every manner of surveillance. But when we try to find out what people in power are doing, such as by investigating factory farms or filing open records requests, that becomes evidence of terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean that corporations have stopped every step they can to find out information about these animal advocacy movements. One example of that is how SeaWorld hired an employee to infiltrate people for the ethical treatment of animals. He's here circled in red right there. in the van going to a demonstration. He was arrested with other activists all the time on SeaWorld's payroll to spy on these protest groups. In my research, I found an entire network of these spy firms that are hired by corporations to do this covert surveillance. So people like the Inkerman Group, INA, and Stratfor create dossiers about what protest movements are doing, funnel this off to the corporations who then can specifically target individual activists. We see that intelligence bubbling up through Homeland Security, through what are called threat assessments that are directly shaping state and national policy. We're also seeing it in FBI documents. This is one I obtained that shows FBI discussion of the possibility of planting rumors within social movements in order to foster distrust and to create disinformation. These are tactics that have been used for decades, and we were told as citizens were put to an end after COINTELPRO and the counterintelligence program of the 60s and 70s, right? This type of covert surveillance, spreading rumors, misinformation, was used against Dr. King, the anti-war movement, Students for a Democratic Society. Corporations have gone to such lengths that they're even creating briefings for law enforcement about political activists and about how to prosecute them. So this is an example from TransCanada, actually sitting down in the room with police, putting up photos and dossiers of political activists, and then instructing law enforcement how to prosecute them as terrorists. So this direct, covert collaboration between industry and law enforcement to label protest as terrorism. Now, I even found out evidence of how my own work has ended up in some of this covert surveillance. Through the Freedom of Information Act, I learned that the counterterrorism unit had been keeping files about my speeches, like this one, about lectures and syllabi I had developed, letters I'd written, emails. They even included this nice little write-up of my book that I include as a shameless self-promo because the counterterrorism unit cites some information saying it's compelling and well-written. So, my hope is that if the counterterrorism unit liked the book, you will too. Unfortunately, I don't have any here to make the sales pitch, but $16.95 on Amazon or whatever. But as a continuation of that argument, of that dual narrative or that double standard we're seeing, it really comes full circle when we're talking about access to government records. This is a story I wrote for Mother Jones about a lawsuit and an open records program. I'd been working with a colleague at MIT named Ryan Shapiro. And Ryan had been filing more open records requests than any other individual in US history. The FBI said he is the most prolific FOIA requester. And we were working together to document how the FBI was monitoring protest groups. That, in turn, became evidence of criminal activity. So bear with me in this circular argument for a second. The government argued in this case that our attempts to gain access to this information was so dangerous to national security that the government needed decades to process these requests and to ensure that no public safety was put at risk by releasing FBI documents. On top of that, the FBI and Department of Justice argued in secret. In other words, we had no idea what arguments were put forward because these were in-camera briefings, redacted filings to the court. Now we get a little indication of what their evidence is for withholding this information that was being presented to the judge. Both at the top here, this highlighted bit that shows the FOIA requests will have an impact on the FBI's ongoing efforts to investigate and combat domestic terrorism. As evidence of that, their citations are redacted, but the first one is referencing the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So I have no idea if that means there are terrorism investigations using the AETA into Ryan Shapiro or myself or any other individuals that we're trying to get documents about, or this is just posturing by the Justice Department, which they never would ever do in court, but to win an important case like this, maybe they're exaggerating the threat of these documents. We just don't know. But it's sending a clear message to the judge. I think the most telling indication of that dual narrative, though, is some of these documents I obtained from the ACLU. They filed open records requests getting some of the FBI's training presentations of how the FBI was teaching new FBI agents to investigate domestic terrorism. This is their slide about animal rights terrorists. If you notice, it's not about criminal activity at all. It's about media. It's about raising awareness through information. So public relations, media, using celebrities, activists to spin the truth. So if all that wasn't chilling enough, seeing the scope of how this terrorism rhetoric is being used to crack down on access to information, unfortunately, the perimeter of that has been growing consistently. I've seen in my work the export of this language of domestic terrorism to other countries as well. So Europol, the European Police Agency, has created these terrorism threat reports in which it identifies activist use of open records laws and undercover investigations as, quote, disinformation campaigns that are a terrorism threat for all of Europe. I was down in Australia for a month a couple of years ago because US-style ag-gag laws, criminalizing video and information gathering, and journalism, I should add, have been directly exported to a completely different legal system and introduced throughout Australia. The same rhetoric of terrorism is appearing as well. Finally, this was a slide that, or a flyer that I obtained in Austria when I was over there for a speaking event. My German is terrible, so I won't translate this off the cuff, but when someone translated it for me before, it loosely says, watch out for animal rights extremists. They're spying on your farms. They're a threat to your women and children. I don't know how. Now, though, ag-gag originally was focused on animal rights activists and nonprofits photographing and videotaping animal cruelty. The first versions of ag-gag were that explicit. You can't take a photograph of a factory farm without consent. The most recent ag-gag law that was passed in North Carolina omits references to animal agriculture or to photography. It's talking about trade secrets and business secrets. All of this is being reframed in part because of the backlash against ag-gag, but I would also argue this new framing allows this model of secrecy and crackdown on information to be exported to other industries, right? Because if you think about it, what corporations would not want to hide from public scrutiny in journalism? The tobacco industry, auto manufacturers, pharmaceuticals, timber and logging, daycare facilities, nursing homes. I mean, there's bad stuff that happens everywhere, and this is a model for cracking down on that information. Now, this all isn't to say on this beautiful sunny day, as I'm delivering all this horrible information to you all, that there aren't victories that are happening. I was a plaintiff in the first constitutional challenge to ag-gag. That was a victory. It was struck down as unconstitutional with the work of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, collaborating with other animal welfare groups. Huge victory. I mean, the kind that you can hope for maybe once in your law career. I mean, the ruling from Judge Windmill was outstanding. I mean, it kind of took every talking point that I could say succinctly in this lecture and packaged it in a much more thoughtful way, including making the argument that if Upton Sinclair, the author of The Jungle, if he were around today, that type of activity and that type of investigation would be criminalized as terrorism. Furthermore, the judge in that case made a strong argument that whenever corporations are saying, well, we have to protect our personal information, sometimes we live on these farms. This is you wouldn't want someone coming into your home and videotaping what you're doing, right? This is stuff that we're seeing every day on the news as how they're defending this. And Judge Windmill said, well, that's not the same at all. Animal agriculture is not a private enterprise. This is not a private operation. This affects food and worker safety and, of course, animal welfare as well. This is a public interest. It's not a private concern. And as I've been following this story, all of it is changing quite quickly in terms of transparency and oversight under the Trump administration. And that's a narrative that is changing too quickly to give you all the very latest and greatest in terrible news. But one thing I wanted to highlight was that early on in his term, the USDA just scrubbed all animal welfare information from its websites. Now, the statement that was put up on the USDA website said this was about concerns about personal privacy. There's very little personal private information in any of these documents. This is about the number of animals used. It's about zoos and factory farms and circuses and breeding facilities. Instead, this is a very explicit attempt to make it more and more difficult to get access to basic information about how these industries work. It's targeting journalists explicitly, but it's also targeting nonprofits and animal advocates and attorneys. I mean, everyone who's using this information to make a case of advocating for social change. What I wanted to highlight, though, this story got quite a bit of attention. I don't know if you all saw it when it came out not too long ago, but it's not unprecedented. In my research, going back to the early 1980s, the industry was lobbying for new exemptions of open records laws to prohibit releasing information to animal advocates and journalists. They've also gone so far as, this was in Iowa, the University of Iowa started building their animal experimentation facilities underground. Now, you can't get a more direct metaphor of what the industry is trying to do right now, right? Than building their facilities underground to keep them away from public sunlight and public scrutiny. I know you all have to cut out probably to run to class in a moment, so we might be perfectly on time and maybe even have time for a couple questions as I've burned through all of this. But if there's one message to leave you all with, especially in the context of your law studies, choosing careers to go into, whether you're going to go into policy or advocacy or work at a firm, the only possible way we can explain this very strange arc that I've documented in my career, beginning with the criminalization as terrorism of nonviolent civil disobedience, and at the very worst, property crimes. To go from that all the way to talking about access to information, to talk about photography, talk about open records request, and label that as terrorism as well, is to understand that there's been a radical shift in these movements so that now, the real front lines in animal advocacy are not about the underground illegal activity. I mean, very little of that is occurring right now. We were talking about broken windows or arson, and you just don't see much news about that. The shift in the animal protection movement has been towards undercover investigations, utilizing open records laws, painting a picture of what happens every single day behind these closed doors, whether it's at a puppy mill or at a factory farm or at a vivisection laboratory. So that's why I would argue the reason that these activists are a threat right now and consistently labeled as terrorism is not that they're breaking windows, it's that they're creating them. And as a journalist, that really speaks to me because I like to put this kind of unwavering faith in the power of education, especially when we're seeing an administration that's so openly and historically hostile to the press, to public exposure, calling journalists the enemies of the American people. I think that's a continuation of a trend that's been emerging for quite some time, that people in power recognize the potential and the danger of public information, especially when that public information is released in a way that everyday people understand it and demand a change. And I think that's why we've seen this move towards censorship and criminalizing information, and why we're going to see a radical acceleration within the presidency and the executive branch of trying to crack down on the press as well. So in that spirit, thank you all so much for having me. I apologize, that was so quick and packed in too much too fast, but I hope that made sense. I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you so much, Will. I will be happy to moderate if anyone has questions. So does anyone have any questions for Will? If not, I'll start off and ask. We have one. Fabulous. Okay.
Hi, thanks so much. So it seems pretty straightforward to me why legislators could be pressured by massive industry into passing these laws, but why would it be a prosecutorial priority for the FBI? I mean, they're always dealing with limited resources. Why would the FBI see this as a priority?
That's the $1,000,000 question. You know, I've gone back and forth about that over the years. Jon Stewart used to play this game on his show called Evil or Stupid. So he'd have two correspondents, right? And he would have some news story, and he'd say, how do we explain this? And one correspondent would say, well, you see, John, it's because such and such is so clearly evil that they're doing this. Another guy would say, oh, no. It's because they're stupid. And so I go back and forth. Does the FBI not understand what truly dangerous threats there are? Or is this an intentional manipulation of the law and of that agency to enforce a political agenda? And the answer is, I think it's both. We've seen more and more evidence of direct collaboration between law enforcement and corporations, not just in terms of lobbying members of Congress, but actually sitting down with the FBI and telling them, these are our priorities. You need to focus on people that are threatening our profits. At some point, though, I think all of this has taken on a life of its own. I really do. This built over decades, especially after 9/11, it accelerated. And then at some point, it just became business as usual. And I think that's really one of the biggest dangers of the war on terrorism more broadly, is it's just become institutionalized. So that if you want a path to career advancement within law enforcement, you have to focus on terrorists. And plenty of former and current FBI agents I've spoken with have said, this is kind of perceived as low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's a path to career advancement, get your name on the mark, make a mark for yourself. And then for others, it's directly facilitating corporate interests as well.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming. I was wondering if you think that the media also has some responsibility for this. I think it's interesting if you look at defamation law, you see courts being very deferential to the media because they want it that way. And I'm just wondering, I usually see there's a lack of journalism event on animal cruelty,
right?
Presumably because people don't want to read it. And do you think that plays any role in this as well?
I think it's a really interesting point, because I think now, especially in a digital era, defining journalism is getting more and more difficult. And I think that's one of the things that's going to come before the courts pretty soon, is that, yes, this is, when this was, ag-gag was struck down, for instance, it was done citing the threat to journalism and citing the threat to the First Amendment. But the people who were gathering that information were nonviolent undercover investigators for nonprofit groups. They were not journalists. I mean, people like me are relying on those sources, are relying on that footage, but I'm not out there actually carrying out an investigation into a factory farm. So those lines are getting really blurry. Who actually is a journalist now? And it's getting even blurrier under Trump, right? You have outright white nationalist, so-called fake news sites like Breitbart being elevated into cabinet positions. So I think that's going to be something that the courts are going to have to wrestle with pretty soon. I don't know if it'll come, butt up directly against defamation, although I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing that kind of language appear as well, especially with these overly litigious corporations that are seeking out any means of defending their profits and defending business interests. I think the use of defamation law probably isn't that far behind. But as you all know, the strongest defense against a defamation suit is what? The truth. And so what they're doing with some of these ag-gag laws, publicly they're trying to sow doubt and distrust about the authenticity of that video, saying, oh, these are spliced together, this is fake footage. No, it's not. There's never been any single claim that's been verified about any of these videos being fake news. But that's the rhetoric that's being used. So it makes me think they're kind of greasing the wheels a little bit for a defamation suit.
I see a question over here.
Actually, just was a shameless plug for our animal law course here. In fact, just today after this class, we have Bernadette Juarez, who's the Deputy Administrator for USDA APHIS, who oversees the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act and Horse Protection Act. And this whole issue of these records being taken off is going to be certainly a hot topic. So it shows the
awesome
kind of folks we have coming in. And also, just want to point out, too, that a lot of people don't realize that, which will just school me on, is that the ag-gag laws were sort of an original provision that was included in the first draft of the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and it was considered too extreme even for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act and was removed. And then at the state level, they started pushing it here and there. And so I wonder if you want to mention that at all.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that I think often we get fixated on federal laws, like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act is a good example. But there's this constant interplay between federal and state as a legislative strategy by these special interest groups. So they'll push the limits with state laws. And before this Animal Enterprise Protection Act was passed, there were a dozen states that passed so-called eco-terrorism laws at the state level. They built some momentum. They introduced a federal law, got that passed in 1992. Then they went back to the states, did the same thing again, kind of hit their limit there, and then passed the AETA, Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Met its limit, then went back and started doing ag laws at the state level. I mean, it's this constant back and forth. So if you're concerned about civil liberties or animal welfare legislation, you can't just focus on one or the other. I mean, it's really a coordinated strategy between the two. And you're absolutely right. Those restrictions on photography and things like that were too bold initially. So it was left out, and then they went to the states where it's a little bit easier to push some of this stuff through, especially with ALEC. ALEC operates at the state level. They have ties to federal legislation as well, but they are a state lobbying, state law organization.
Any other questions? I have a question for you,
Yeah.
Which is the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act treats certain kinds of activity as terrorist activity. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the consequence of being labeled a terrorist instead of just like a property destroyer for sentencing, for oversight, for prison, for all that.
Oh, that's a really important point because, essentially what I'm making is quite a conservative argument to say that there are existing laws for criminal activity. We don't need to carve out a new law to go after that same activity. So that shift isn't just a semantic one. Once you say something, well, this isn't property destruction, this is terrorism, that's not just a change in how people are talked about. It has serious ramifications once they enter the prison system, for instance. A lot of reporting I've done has been on these experimental prisons called communications management units. We don't have a lot of time here, but I did a TED Talk on the topic that kind of thoroughly documented. To my knowledge, I'm the only journalist who's been inside one of these CMUs. And the only way I find out about them is because they housed at one time an animal rights activist and an environmentalist who were sent there not because of their crimes, but because of their inspirational significance, using the language of the units themselves. The inspirational significance they had within the broader movements that they're affiliated with. So it redefines people in that way. Even people that are just sent to a so-called normal prison, like Jake Conroy was sent to FCI Victorville in California. He had no record, but was still sent to a very dangerous prison. He was what was called red carded. And that means he was designated with a red card that he had to check in with prison officials every few hours, every day, because he was designated as such a dangerous prisoner. Now, there are people in that prison that had a lot of paperwork related to murder and rape and actual real violent crimes that did not have red cards. So another element, I guess a third way that changes your experience being labeled as a terrorist is that all eyes are on you when you walk into that prison. If you have that red card, or if the guards had spread information about how you're this extremist, the other prisoners are like, what the hell is going on? Like, what did you actually do? And Jake said, well, we ran this website. And they're like, no, what did you actually do? And it's funny, but it's also really dangerous, because what you don't want in prison is for people to speculate about why you're really there, because that could mean that you're a government informant or a sex offender, which are the two most dangerous possible labels you can have in any prison. So it has consequences in a lot of different ways. Beyond that, though, I mean, from just a civil liberties or a civil rights argument, I would say that rhetoric of terrorism is directly shaping the perceptions of the courtroom before any of these defendants actually have their day in court. I mean, this is the most powerful language we possibly have right now in this country. So to say someone is a terrorist, to have these headlines labeling someone as a terrorist, to have press releases calling them a terrorist, and then when you finally enter the courtroom, everyone's seeing all of that stuff. It obviously prejudices the jury, it prejudices the judge. These aren't experts on animal rights in activism. What they've seen is, influential to them. So I would argue, if nothing else, it's shaping whether or not people can have access to a fair trial. This is a use of language that is elevating sentences, but it's also increasing the probability that people, if they're actually arrested, will go to prison because of that scaremongering as well.
Thank you so much, Will. And so we're going to wrap up now. So I'd love everyone to give Will another round of applause.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for your time. And will you be around a couple minutes if people want to come up?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll put my email up too. And again, I know I went through a lot of information really quickly. If you have any specific questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to talk about that as well if you have class.